Now we are moving to a second session, session 2, on collaborative contracts, project governance, and setup. And it's really my privilege to have with us a fantastic group of panelists. So as you will see from the slide, so we have Gemma Wittig from Bechtel Civil Infrastructure, who is involved in Sydney Metro here. Then we have Kate, and I'm not going to dare to pronounce your surname, Kate, because I don't want to become embarrassed, from the University of Toronto. And Kate has been doing extremely insightful research on the relationship between capital-intensive organizations and non-market stakeholders. And I will let Kate tell us a bit more about that. And Peter Colascino, that I have not met personally yet here in Australia, but I understand that he had a major role with Infrastructure Australia, and just recently you have set up a consultancy Vista Strategy. So I'm really excited with the structure of this panel. This is about collaborative contracts, project governance, and setup. But the emphasis here is not going to be on collaborative contracts to govern the project supply chain. Rather, the emphasis here on the contracts to govern what sometimes we call these non-market stakeholders. So like the local communities, local authorities, activists, interest groups, which are becoming increasingly important for project leaders, especially as society expects more and more from capital-intensive projects. Now, the kind of expects that the purpose of these projects be defined by grand challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality. But at the same time, despite all these challenges in addressing these wicked problems, the managers of these big projects are also quite constrained by a legacy of project management norms that say, well, guys, you have to deliver the project on time and within budget. So how can you reconcile that legacy of on time, on budget, the golden triangle, with this increasing pressure to widen the purpose of projects? And so that's, and of course, this is going to have direct impact on the management of the relationships with the supply chain, which is so we have these two orthogonal relationships here going on. So to kick off this discussion, I've asked Kate to go first and share some insights from our own research. Then Peter will share the view of the policymaker, and then Gemma, who is really as skin in the game as acting director of Sydney Metro, and I'm sure she has she's right now thinking about how to tackle some of these challenges. And after a first set of introductions, we will we'll continue the conversation in the panel. Kate, so would you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Nuno, and thank you for the University of Sydney for hosting us. So just so I don't bury the headline, my research, and I think part of the answer to Nuno's question, is collaborate with your critics. So let me elaborate what I mean by that. So because we're talking about capital-intensive projects, today I'm going to focus on the rise of formal contracting between project proponents and local communities. Some of you may know there's been a real increase in the use of formal contracts. They're sometimes called community benefits agreements, impact benefits agreements, and they're meant to manage relationships with communities that are proximate to a major project like a mine, an oil and gas facility, hydroelectric, wind developments. And in these contracts, the community provides consent or support for a new project or investment in return for some sort of benefits. And there's usually a mutually agreed upon dispute resolution mechanism written into the contract. Benefits by the community that are reaped by the community are wide-ranging. They can often include things like local hiring, procurement targets, grants for local development initiatives, ways to limit the negative impacts of a development, and sometimes even the distribution of profits to the community. Now, if this is sounding really expensive and complicated to you, then you're in the same boat my co-author and I were in about 7 years ago when we started to set out to find out when and why these companies do this. And so here's what we did and found. We looked at all the mining companies proposed in Canada over the last 20 years or so, and looked at which ones had signed one of these contracts, these community benefits agreements, and with which community. Over 300 of them had been signed. And what we found is that project proponents were more likely to sign these CBAs with communities that bore the brunt of environmental and social externalities associated with the project, with communities that had use rights to the land where the project was to be situated. And finally, with communities that had a history of engaging in protest, not against the focal firm, but in protest in general. So that might sound a little strange, right? So you're signing contracts with people that might be or already troublemakers. Well, it turns out investors also like that too. So in a separate study, we looked at the stock market reactions to the unexpected announcements of these contracts. And it turns out that signing a contract with a community with strong property rights to the land or a history of protesting actually more than doubled the value of the median market cap firm in our sample. So rather than being viewed as a cost of doing business, formal contracts with communities can be actually seen as an investment that pays out. Now you may be wondering, okay, how does this make sense? But if you consider the costs that are associated with the withdrawal of community consent for a major project, once it's started construction or is operational, it starts making sense. In mining, the cost of a local community withdrawing its consent and the project proponents being prevented from actually accessing the mine are estimated somewhere around $20 million per week for projects with a capex of $3 billion. Another study found that upwards of 70% of the valuation of gold mines is actually determined by the degree to which these non-market stakeholders support the mine. That could be politicians, local communities, activists. So when you consider that these formal contracts not only provide benefits to communities to help them offset some of the externalities that are naturally associated with any major project, but they also detail the ways by which the project proponent and the local community are going to make mutual adjustments over the life of the project and solve the disputes about the project outside the court system or outside the court of public opinion. You start realizing that these are effectively mechanisms by which you can de-risk the cash flows from major projects. So I'm going to end there. That's a lot I just threw out at you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kate. Peter, would you want to follow up on this and perhaps relate also these insights from Canada with what's happening here on the ground in Australia?
Thanks so much, Nuno, and thanks, Kate, and thank you for the invitation to join the panel. I want to start just by reflecting really quickly on an often confused aspect when we start to talk about the community, which is for very large public infrastructure that users and the community are a single group, that these people are the same with the same expectations, whereas indeed a user of an asset may return to their home if, for instance, it's a transport project, and turn from a user to a community member with a completely different set of considerations. And just to create a frame on that, certainly some work I was previously involved with at Infrastructure Australia focused very much on users being motivated by access, quality and cost of infrastructure services, whereas the community indeed being much more closely tied to sustainability orientated factors, or as I've seen in the comments this morning, the reference to ESG. So tying in ecological and environmental benefits, thinking about social implications, perhaps through social procurement or business enablement, thinking obviously about the economic impact of assets, including to some of those groups I've mentioned, but the final aspect around governance. And I really would like to take the opportunity this morning to accentuate and emphasize that final lens of a more holistic view of sustainability, thinking around governance, transparency, participatory decision-making, tying the outcomes of a project to the long-term vision and values of a community, and indeed embedding that in Project 13 parlance in the notion of outcomes. So for policymakers, often the priority in thinking about outcomes is to look cross-sector, breaking down verticals as could exist within infrastructure, for instance, a transport lens as distinct to energy or water, or indeed social infrastructure, and indeed trying to much better define those key aspects of value to a community, thinking about standard of living and thinking around some of those multi-factor aspects tied to sustainability. Thinking and clarifying and, in fact, codifying and defining outcomes for a society is incredibly difficult for political decision makers, and as a result, incredibly difficult for policymakers. But indeed, landing a crystallization of those issues, as has been achieved in some jurisdictions in Australia, for instance, New South Wales through the Premier's priorities, is critical to allowing a golden thread to be connected from the centre of government through to delivery, through to policy agencies and ultimately to project delivery. This idea of defining some outcomes, building them into a multi-sector strategy, embedding in spatial considerations, and ultimately project delivery. And indeed, that continuity is critical to ensure infrastructure delivers services rather than monument building, concrete and steel, and to make sure that those services are ultimately aligned to the community's expectations and able to be translated into an understanding of place. So those place-centric considerations, translating national goals into meaningful local understanding, ensuring that expert engagement and leadership in the community is able to see those outcomes embedded in a meaningful way and carried through not on a single project, but to shared outcomes across multiple projects is critical for success. And just one final point before I hand back to Nuno to mention, in Australia over the last decade, around $20 billion worth of projects have been cancelled, mothballed, or otherwise delayed due to community opposition, a really quite incredible number. And indeed, I feel it's a gross underrepresentation of the true costs of community opposition or barriers, where we see today many projects with teams of hundreds of staff mobilized, seeing those teams not working, tied up because of delays, perhaps in environmental approval processes or other restrictions on work. And that hidden cost is held directly by the community in terms of delays of specific projects, but also because of the reduced market capacity to deliver on what is a very ambitious investment program. So these costs are considerable, and indeed they're building today. Thanks very much, Nuno.
Thank you, Peter. So with this background, perhaps Gemma can now give us some vivid illustration of how she's handling the relationship with the local communities in the context of Sydney Metro.
All right, thanks very much, Nuno. And yes, definitely, the introductions from Kate and Peter have resonated very, very close to home with me. So just a bit of an intro to myself and the Sydney Metro project. So I'm currently in the role of delivery director for the Western Tunnelling Package on the Sydney Metro project, Sydney Metro West. I currently work for Bechtel Infrastructure Group, and Bechtel are engaged as an integrated delivery partner with Sydney Metro West. And so we provide professionals into key roles and also integration across the Metro West. So we're very much working hand in hand, and I see myself as part of the Sydney Metro team. So very much embedded in that team. So the Western Tunnelling Package, for those of you who don't know, consists of 9 kilometres of dual bore TBM tunnels from Sydney Olympic Park through to Westmead, with a major earthworks package at Clyde, and that's where we're building up an earthworks platform for the future maintenance and stabling facility. This will be the only surface expression of the railway along the alignment. We're approximately 8 months into execution on what will be a 4-year project. So I've worked for Bechtel for 10 years and I started as a mechanical engineer, and I've worked my way into design and project management. And this is my second major infrastructure project. So I've moved originally from our old oil and gas, now energy business unit about 4 years ago into major infrastructure projects. So previously working on Crossrail and now Sydney Metro. Obviously, you know, from my perspective, the difference between a refinery or a gas plant is that the community impact is on these major infrastructure projects is immediate and obviously extremely critical for success. So from a Sydney Metro perspective, they undertake extensive mapping, planning, consultation, and where required, the agreement negotiations, so community benefit agreements, as Kate referred to them before, with a range of non-market stakeholders. So these stakeholders on the Western Tunnelling package include local councils, businesses, multinational organisations, residents, schools, hospitals and emergency services, Aboriginal communities and land councils, utility companies, even nearby major projects that are taking place around the Western Sydney area, and other transport agencies and state departments. So critical for the success is obviously that early engagement and early planning prior to award, so that we have those expectations and agreements, if required, locked in prior to award. So some of the other key challenges that we face on a project like Sydney Metro are construction noise and out of hours working, property acquisition, which is required for a major project such as Sydney Metro West, supporting businesses and residential stakeholders in either relocation or helping them with the business disruption. We've also going through substratum acquisition as well. There's also other impacts, which include utility outages, maintaining access, even restoration of buildings, negotiating access to areas, and obviously the cumulative impacts of other major projects going on in the area. So Parramatta being a good example of where there is a lot of major projects going on in that space, with the Parramatta Light Rail project in conjunction with Sydney Metro coming through now as well. So obviously as a publicly funded project, it's important that we use that funding appropriately and with a clear public purpose for the resolution of any issues that come to hand. But as Kate and Peter have also touched on, once we're in a live contract, these negotiations with the community become even more critical to ensure that we don't start to have a cost and a time impact to the project. So, because there may be some activities that are contingent on approval from a key stakeholder. So to mitigate that, sort of Sydney Metro have stakeholder and community focus with place managers, and we have that both within the Sydney Metro team and also within the contractors team as well. And those place managers and also interface managers are there to engage with the community early and also throughout the life cycle of the project, to ensure that our construction timelines are met as well. So we maintain a very proactive approach, and also to make sure that we're keeping our stakeholders informed along the way. So it's just a bit of an introduction.
Okay, thanks very much, and so perhaps I would, on that note, I would go back to Kate and ask Kate, from your research, because not all communities want to negotiate. No, sometimes people are ideologically opponent to a project, and if you sit around the negotiating table and try to build consensus, that consensus will never occur, because ideologically these people believe that the only solution to the problem is that this project is not going to happen. So from your research with mining organizations, what kind of insights do you have to share with managers? Where do they draw the line? When do they know that it's not going to work to try to put effort and resources and time to achieve these community benefit agreement? What sort of intuitions do they use to understand how to deal with these no-market stakeholders, Kate?
So the ones that are ideologically opposed is challenging. First of all, I think what you would want to do is actually determine if it's an ideological opposition. And this is not specific to my research. I used to work in these agreements professionally up in the Canadian Arctic. And sometimes it may look ideological, but there are other politics at play. And so I think sort of uncovering and getting a little bit more intelligence and understanding the position of the community as it relates to other things in their environment. The specific example I'm thinking about is an Indigenous community that was blocking a $16 billion natural gas pipeline. And it's certainly the rhetoric and the framing of their concerns sounded ideological, but if you step back and understood that their land claim agreements were not being or heard by the federal government, you could understand that this was actually a triadic governance problem, right? The federal government was not addressing a legitimate land claim issue that was basically in turn causing this community to hold up the project. And so I would always sort of hesitate to sort of say, is this a deadlock ideological opposition? I would do more research. I think there's a lot more going on. Beyond that, I feel like I don't have as much of the project proponent perspective that perhaps someone like Peter or Jenna would have, where they've come across that. I know in my other research with environmental activists, and this is more on the sort of consumer product side, there are real benefits to collaborating with people that are your opponents. Mm-hmm. But there's a line where ideology will never allow you to see eye to eye, right? So the idea with collaboration is you, with your sort of opponent or potential critic, are coming to an understanding over time that is eventually sort of codified in some sort of contract or some sort of agreement. There will be some counterparties where I think that progress would be very, very difficult to make.
Okay, so, and Peter, how can policymakers help, given that there is this range of opposition, some of which can evolve into a cooperative relationship and even be codified into a community benefit agreement or other sort of agreement. But in some other cases, and I'm thinking about High Speed 2 in the UK, where the project has been legally approved, they have the right to acquire land, but activists continue to try to prevent the project from going ahead, and they even had to ask for an injunction to be able to criminalize any activist that gets near the project and tries to stop the project. So I know that in the UK we have sometimes these budget uplifts, so they know that there are going to be problems, and so they give managers a pot of money by which they can try to manage these no-market stakeholders and try at the same time to keep this narrative that the project is on time, on budget, which is also an important narrative. But perhaps as a policymaker, you have other insights how to try to reconcile these challenges of managing no-market stakeholders, and at the same time with a narrative that's also society expects that everything is going fine, we'll be delivering on time and on budget.
Nuno, there's so much in what you've just commented on there, so let me try to touch on some of it to say and to indeed bring the conversation back just a couple of steps. Infrastructure and indeed more broadly, large projects are about delivering on the expectations of society and the community. So infrastructure most particularly exists for public good, but some of the resource projects that Kate mentioned are ultimately, in a gas sense, ultimately about enabling energy or about supporting industrial processes or perhaps fuel for export. But what we really need to keep in mind is they are about servicing a market And that market is the user group, who ultimately is the first group of proponents or supporters for a project within a community. So really important to make sure that you are able to crystallize those messages, as I've mentioned before, around access, quality, and cost of services. But in doing that, it's critical not to lose sight of the legitimacy of the community's view. We all live somewhere, ideally, and for most of us, we're passionate about our communities, and we place particular values on what defines it and why we've chosen to call it home. So it's really important to take those outcomes, as I've mentioned earlier, and to be able to communicate them in a way that aligns with the values of place, so that people can understand how those project aims and objectives that might be national or attached to the users are able to create some value for them within the place they call home, or the place that they might conduct their business. In doing that, Project 13 and indeed collaborative contracts broadly provide a mechanism, which is to define outcomes up front and to create flexibility through the procurement and tender process to allow industry to innovate to deliver those outcomes. So this really critical component of collaborative contracting, which is around moving away from solution definition right up front, allows industry and those involved in project delivery to innovate, to change, to tweak scope in order to make sure they're delivering a project that can balance those expectations. So I really think that we need to consider the role of collaborative contracting, not just about the relationship between industry and client, but also how community can be brought more into that process, the roles of practices like deliberative democracy that might allow some level of empowerment of a group of people that are closer to the community that's impacted, in order to make decisions within a predefined set of boundaries around issues or around resources and time. And we've seen that deliver some success in Australia. And I'd point to the New Democracy Foundation, an organisation that was funded in its setup from the family, the Bongiorno Nettis, who established Transfield, one of Australia's long-term historical tier one contractors who are involved in critical projects like the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. The Bongiorno Nettis family saw the value around that localisation and engagement, and indeed the role of the community in that empowered decision-making.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Jim, building on the Peter's remarks, I'm quite intrigued about the extent to which you find the flexibility in the relationships with your suppliers to accommodate the vagaries and the realization of uncertainty that derives from the relationship with the communities. So we have seen that irrespective if we are on a lump sum contract or reimbursable type of contracts, the fact is that there will be, as you deal with local communities, this is going to put pressure on the execution of your supplier contract. And sometimes there is this suspicion that suppliers then become opportunistic, and even so they will start, well, we now need to adapt the targets, and this costs more and more and more. And so some people are skeptical that actually collaborative contracts with the supply chain are having the effect that we would want in terms of preventing suppliers from behaving opportunistically in the face of uncertainty that results from interaction with non-market stakeholders. What is your perception on that? To what extent you are finding that collaborative contracts with suppliers are encouraging the right behaviors when it comes to facilitate interaction with non-market stakeholders?
So, sorry, Nuno. So thank you. Yeah, at the moment, thankfully, we're not seeing that behaviour from the contractors, but obviously recognise that there is that risk. However, I mean, it's going back to that, trying to engage early in the planning processes within before the project is let or tendered, to really define what those relationships are, and and also and make sure that we've got, you know, sufficient mapping, engagement, and also feedback that then feeds into our contracts, so that we can have you know, a clear expectation with these community and key stakeholders around how the project is going to be delivered and what are their requirements, which then can be fed into the contract, and then the contractor has a good visibility of what to expect. Obviously, you know, we can't always you know, anticipate certain situations that come up, but the contractor is given as much information as they can, and given ownership for those relationships. Obviously, really closely working with Sydney Metro as well, because we have, you know, for example, on Western Tunnelling Package, we've got just a 4-year program, but the entire Sydney Metro program is, you know, 8 to 10 years, which will be, you know, we have to have ongoing relationships with these community stakeholders. So we need to work collaboratively. And yes, okay, there probably is some skepticism, but I think it's really just working together. And at the moment, thankfully, everything is going well, but it's also reputational risk for our contractors as well. So if they start to behave, you know, poorly and try to leverage certain uncertainties or you know, difficulties for their own outcome, that will, you know, it doesn't reflect well on them either. So they've got buy-in into the outcomes for the project as well. They want to succeed, and together we succeed. So it's very much working hand in hand, because, you know, it's not us and them, it's us all pulling in the right direction, and as well as the community as well, because, you know, for an infrastructure project like a metro, we are there to service the community in the end.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we have about 3 minutes, and so I have perhaps a quick question for each one of you. Kate, the mining industry was famous for some years ago, this approach that some of my colleagues call DAD, no? Decide, announce, do. So a very autocratic approach. And what you show is actually it has shifted towards a much more collaborative approach. And as you mentioned, doing community benefit agreements is not cheap. So what was the trigger? What made the mining industry change attitude?
There was a bunch of disasters, right? High-profile disasters helped in Canada as well as in Australia. The acquiring of formal rights of Indigenous peoples, right? That started bringing to light some of these issues. And finally, I think people are starting to cost into the projects actual risks related to non-market stakeholders. I teach this in my MBA class, and people's like heads explode. They don't do this. Like when you run a net present value model in, you know, Procter & Gamble or wherever, no one is doing this. I think the construction industry and large product industry is one of the first industries in the world that's actually costing this stuff into their projects now.
And that is a fantastic lead for Peter, because if we start costing the relationship with non-market stakeholders, but if benefit to cost analysis does not account for non-user benefits, Peter, now we are in trouble, because from a value for money perspective in a traditional metric, no project will be value for money, because you have a lot of cost going into the denominator and you don't see extra benefits going into the numerator. To what extent do you see policymakers willing to update also traditional metrics to that measure value for money?
I definitely see the willingness of progressive policymakers to update their methodologies, but we need to be mindful that cost-benefit analysis is just one tool. It's not something that we should establish as the only mechanism for project decision-making. Ultimately, we're trying to drive our communities forward, so there are other tools that we need to keep in mind, as well as that focus on the objectives we're trying to unlock for the community.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Kate, between consultation often is something that needs to be done before the project is approved, but consultation does not, it's often the commitments that come out of consultation are what the law says you need to do, not necessarily that they go above and beyond the law. To what extent you see the outcomes of the negotiations with local communities going way above and beyond the law, so relatively to what had been promised during consultation?
Gemma, they often are
actually, it was for Gemma question. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I think we. So, I mean, I don't think anything goes above and beyond the law. Obviously, we work a lot of our consultation around our environmental impact studies. So for Sydney Metro West, that is split up into 3 stages. So we've been through EIS 1, 2, and 3. And it's all the community feedback is then written into our conditions of approval, and that in itself is also a negotiation. So you know, it has to be on the lines of reasonableness as well. We can't just incorporate anybody's you know, wish list. It has to be, you know, it has to have that going back to that public purpose and an appropriate use of public funding. So that's really how that's kind of managed through that lens. So hopefully I've answered the question there.
Okay, so it's we just arrived to the end of our panel. This we could continue the conversation for another hour, but we do need to go. And thank you all the panelists. It was I really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we will continue this conversation in the future through other ways. Thank you very much. Bye bye.